Hello, I'm Scott Montgomery of the Small Town Mercer. I'm starting this video series that's going to take place over a long period of time because I've been thinking about our financial situation for quite some time. Um, I used to do a lot of energy sector stuff back in that was several years ago now, a few years ago anyway, for a couple of think tanks. And so since 2018, when I retired basically, um, I've been wanting to put together a think tank that talks about money and financing. What is the best way to do this? Because, during the last election back in 2016, that became a hot topic. And I began to think about this. The big issue, I actually, since March of 2018, is when I started to put this together. And now I'm going to put out a series of videos as to what is the best way forward for a sound and financial situation for all. And it's a very involved topic, and I'm going to go over a lot of things. But the Small Town Mercer is now a full fledged cryptocurrency think tank. I don't know if there are any others in the sector, but I'm not aware of any. So I'm going to add my voice to this because I've done a lot of studying on this topic. So in 2018, the thing that led me to this topic was simply this. We were having an argument in this country. Donald Trump was the president at the time, and he was doing something that a lot of people thought was very controversial. He was imposing a lot of tariffs. And I began to think about what was the ultimate goal of these tariffs. People were complaining that it was upsetting the world economic system, putting it out of balance, making it very, I should say, adversarial, pitting one country against another. And people were going so far as to say, well, it may cause a lot of upheaval in the world and maybe a lot of warfare. But I began to think about this, and I thought to myself, I made some notes here. What Number one, what makes a nation wealthy? How does a nation get wealthy, or in our case, stay wealthy? And I'm mostly focused on how do we stay wealthy? And what is the goal of the citizenry in which they would consider themselves wealthy? The arguments you hear all the time, well, we're the wealthiest nation and we can't, the people in the country are suffering and it's not fair. Only a few people own everything and most people don't own anything, and all this rhetoric. And I said, well, look, we have to look into this topic. So the first question I sought to ask, and I'm going to write that down. I hope I write big enough. But the first question I sought to ask was, what well, I wrote it down here. Hold on. what type of what type of system keeps us wealthy or maintains wealth? All right, so I'll write that down. What type of system do we have that maintains our wealth? How are we the wealthiest nation ever? And how are we not benefiting from that? How, how is that possible? What has happened? And so I started to say to myself, you know, what has happened with our way of keeping ourselves wealthy? And I'm talking about the majority of people in the country. Because I've always felt that, by and large, the majority of people in this country are wealthy, all right, or well off. Now, is that true? No, not necessarily, because it has to be sustainable. And so that was the next point I went to sustainability. So, how do we keep our wealth? Well, I began to think about how this country became prosperous and how it, in its heyday, it was very prosperous. And we were very prosperous for a long period of time. We had a system in place for the most part. And if you remember, and I'm going to go over this in future videos, but if you remember, um, at the founding of this country, we were kind of a fledgling nation, and we were largely an agricultural nation, right? So after the Civil War, we became more of an industrial nation, and the industrial nation is what made us great. We had industry, and we also had a large agricultural sector, right? So we had both industry and agriculture, and a lot of America was very rural, and a lot of America produced a lot of goods. So you had about what, 200 million people, let's say? 200 million people. About 50 million or so were employed in what type of jobs? And let's just go back to the 1970s for a second. So in the 1970s, what type of jobs did we do? Most people did manufacturing, right? Wow, I got to learn to write. I got to hold my pen this way. Manufacturing. We had a service industry. We had now in those days technologies. Oops. Technologies were what? Oh, that's horrible writing. Sorry. Technologies were what? Technologies were radio, um, television, um, appliances, cars. That was our technology. It was a lot of manufacturing. There was a lot of electronics. Remember Radio Shack? You had a lot of things like that. Um, we made a lot of stuff. Tires, cars. A lot of that was made here. Some of it was made overseas. Some of it was made in Mexico and Canada. That was kind of starting out. You also had started to have foreign competition in the 1970s, but largely a lot of that was made in America. We made a lot of glass products, appliances, like I said, parts for a variety of things. You made timber products, housing, concrete, bricks, all that stuff was made here in America. Food processing, that was starting to become very big. I mean, really big. It was already big, but prior to that, but it was getting really big. I remember in the 1970s, you had food processing all over the place. You're starting to get like the people are starting to eat things like fast food, McDonald's, and they were getting the product, the food frozen and freeze dried and shipped in. Frozen foods were big in the grocery stores, packaged foods, those type of things. They were really starting to come about 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so a lot of people were involved in that industry, selling it, manufacturing it, and what have you. And you had other industries as well. You had transportation industries, clothing industries. You had people were selling things. Stores. You had store employees. You know, a lot of that. 120 million people or so were employed back then, and there were times where you had high unemployment, but usually it was temporary. I would say, especially after World War II. 1970s was a bit of a harder decade, but those companies still existed. By the 1980s, you kind of had a shift in economic policy, and a lot of smaller businesses were doing well. But you also had a lot of consolidation as well. That's when we got the idea of a free trade and lower interest rates and things like that to spur the economy. And then you get to the 1990s, and what do you see? You see two major shifts happening in our economy. You had NAFTA, which largely made it so that a lot of products that were made here, clothing products, shoes, what have you, were starting to be made elsewhere. And even American companies were starting to make things in, across the border, Canada, Mexico, or even overseas. China was starting to make things in the 90s, I think, and even earlier, maybe. But I know Taiwan, Korea, and Japan before them were doing the same thing. Radios and electronic equipment started to be made overseas. Um, that even probably started in the 1960s. But in the 1970s, they were still making things here. You know, most of our appliances, I think, were made here. Whirlpool, Amana, a lot of our, uh, I would say, beauty products like soap and toothpaste and things like that were made here. I think they more or less still are, but you know what I mean. Toothbrushes and pens and pencils and things like that. Everything was pretty much made here. And then it slowly but surely it went. And then what replaced it? Not so much manufacturing, service technologies. You had a lot of agriculture back then. We're still talking in the 1970s. You had agriculture. You had transportation, right? Hope you can see that. I'm not going to write any lower. But you had several sectors, several industries. And today, today we have about 350 million people in the country. But a lot of those industries we don't have anymore. And what do we have today? Well, we still have the tech industry. We still have transportation industry, right? We still have medical industry. It's bigger now than it was back then. You know, we still have the service industry. It's not as big as it once was because we don't have as many large malls and department stores anymore. But the service industry has still got, you've still got your McDonald's, you've still got your Amazon, you've still got, instead of taxi drivers, you have Uber and all that stuff now. You have many other services. I'm going to get into the service industry because it was a large employer even back in the 70s, but it's even larger now. What else do you have today that's very popular? I guess you still have construction type jobs. You had that then too, but not so much the manufacturing. Not so much what I used to call the big ticket jobs. And what do I mean by the big ticket jobs? The big ticket jobs were jobs, and let me write that down actually. Let me erase this real quick and write that down. Your big ticket jobs. And this is what they had. This is what they had in common. All right? This is what they had in common. Number one, long-term employment. Long-term employment. Okay? I'll just abbreviate it there so I get to talking. Long-term employment. That was the first thing. Most people worked at these jobs for 25, 30 years. Many people did. You would work there, you'd come out of high school maybe, let's say at age 18. You'd work there 30 years, you'd become a floor manager or something when you were 40, let's see, 18, 28, 38, 48, you'd be a floor manager and you'd be making a really decent wage at the age of 48. And then you'd do that for 10 years maybe, and you'd be there, what, 40 years. So you'd be 58, 60 years old, 61 years old. You'd think about retirement. And back then, Social Security was considered a supplement. Most people saved money because the inflation allowed them to. You generally, your wages kept up with inflation or were close to inflation. Um, they were not greatly overwhelmed by inflation, so people had a savings. They had interest. They had some type of a retirement, maybe. A lot of people had pensions. A lot of people who didn't have pensions, they had savings, and they made money. Their savings accounts paid, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% a year. By the time they were 60, 61 years old, they would retire after about 40 or so, some odd years working for a company, and they probably had a fair amount of money in the bank, um, enough to where they could, their house was paid for probably. So they had enough to live on. You had some Social Security to supplement that maybe. And, people in that age group, their investments, they maybe had a few stocks or whatever and paid dividends. And so, they weren't uber wealthy, but they had plenty of money to live well beyond, their retirement years. A lot of people back then lived into their 70s and 80s. So most people, that was it for them. They get to their 80s and they would be dead. So they would live maybe 20 years past retirement, and they would have plenty of money. They still had plenty of money in the bank. They still, maybe their children sold their house and inherited that money, and then they had plenty of money. Taxes were slightly higher, but you know they weren't super high, so they were affordable in most parts of the country. Some of the more populated states, it was probably a little higher because they had more services. But you could afford to live, so you had long-term employment. And most people, if you did a good job, you weren't laid off or fired. The company did well. Like I said, those companies, a lot of them are still around. What was the second thing? The second thing in a big ticket job, a lot of them were unionized, so they had pensions. Pensions, right? So when you worked your 35, 40 years, you retired, you had a good pension. I remember I used to have a Ford worker, and I'm sorry, I used to have a neighbor when I lived in California growing up, and I was, beyond high school. We had the Ford plant in the Bay Area. It's now a mall. I think it's still a mall. You never know. But yeah, he worked for the Ford plant. I think he graduated high school sometime in the 1950s, and this was I was working my first job. I think back then it was about 1980, and he had worked there for 25 years. And they were going to move the Ford plant, close it down, and move it somewhere else. And they offered him a job, and he was a manager there. I think he was a foreman, and he'd been there for 25 years, and he was probably around 50 years old. And he decided that he was going to move. I forget where. I think they moved it down to Southern California. I'm not sure, but anyway, he decided he was going to move with the company instead of staying there, and he moved down with the company. I think he worked another 10 years or so, something like that. I think this was about 1980. He worked till about 1990. I think he was about 58, 59, 60 when he retired, but I think he was 58 when he retired. And he had to work 2 years. I forget some rule, he couldn't take his pension till he was 60. So he worked 2 years for I think it was Ford Motor Company, but he worked in a different division. So they moved him over for 2 years to where he did some kind of office work. And then at age 60, he retired. And so probably in the early 90s, he retired. And he was going to get a pension for I don't know, 30, 35 years. I think 35 years. So up until he was 95 years old. And he had for his lifetime, and his pension was about 75% of his salary. And for his lifetime, he had his medical and all that covered. So, and I think so did his wife. So that was another thing. A third thing you have to remember was that they had good wages, and that's something to remember. Um, a lot of the manufacturers, they sold a lot of cars, sold a lot of washing machines, sold a lot of refrigerators, whatever, clothing. All this was made here, and so this is part of why some of the jobs moved away. Taxes and wages were getting high for the employer, and so that was what started it. But at least back during this time in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people made good wages, and why would they move jobs? Why would they go job to job to job to job to job and hunting down whatever benefits they could? Everybody got those good benefits, at least for the majority of these companies they did. And so, and you also made decent wages, so you were able to keep up with inflation. But then something happened in 1971 because of a snafu in the Bretton Woods system. In other words, money money used to be tied to gold. Um, we didn't have as much gold, and so a lot of people started to realize that inflation was starting to outpace, and gold was less and less a factor in money. And so a lot of people, a lot of countries, especially hurt by the World War, the Second World War, they wanted their gold back, and we had taken it all in lieu of helping them out, you know. And we couldn't give it back to them. We didn't have enough. And so we just got rid of the gold standard. And we convinced a large part of the world to, instead of taking gold, instead we were going to print and give them dollars. And so basically the US currency became the world currency. And so we kept inflating, inflating, inflating to make up for that difference. All right? And so now inflation becomes a problem. And the world changed, didn't it? We don't have I mean, think about it. I mean, let's say you're a stock investor. Do you own Goodyear? Do you aspire to work for Goodyear or Firestone or Ford or General Electric or Boeing or, a lot of these manufacturing companies? Probably not, because they probably don't have the jobs. Do you want to work for Chevron? It'd be nice to work for Chevron, but they only have so many jobs. Maybe they employ 50 to 75,000, instead of 200,000 like they did at one point. Okay, these are not easy jobs to come by. There aren't that many of them anymore. So what do we have today? Well, like I said, you have tech, services, and so forth. Well, a lot of these jobs don't pay what they used to. So let's take the service industry, for example. The service industry, you do have some good paying jobs, right? Banking, investing, right? I'm just going to abbreviate. Uh, Insurance can pay a lot if you're a lead agent or you have your own agency. If you're working for an agent, maybe not. You're starting out, maybe not. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. What else in the service industry can we think of? How about upper management? You know, right? Upper management. I'm going to abbreviate again. Upper management, let's say you're the manager of a hotel, manager of a restaurant, a nice restaurant, manager of a cybersecurity service of some sort. You're the manager of whatever, dry cleaning industry or maybe a bunch of gyms or something. Or maybe you're a district manager of grocery stores, or maybe you're some kind of a manager or assistant manager of a hospital group, or something like that. You know what I'm talking about. So they employ quite a few people, I'd say, but not a huge amount, unless they're a chain. Maybe you're a manager of a district manager of Lowe's or Home Depot or something. So there are quite a few of those, but all in all, I don't know if all these industries employ, maybe they do 50 to 75 million people altogether, maybe they do today. But the problem is that a lot of service industries are not in that echelon, let's say. A lot of them are what? What other that don't pay as well? McDonald's, right? You're a McDonald's worker. They don't pay as well. Or let's say you're a delivery guy, right? I'm not talking about FedEx or UPS, but just a pizza delivery guy or something like that. They pay okay. They don't. I don't think that's great wages, but you make enough money. So maybe not a McDonald's worker, but what other? You work at the Walmart, let's say. You work in the shipping, the warehouse, that type of thing. You're not going to make a ton of money doing that. You're going to make okay money. And really, when you look at it, you look at these high-paying jobs, and whereas in the 1970s, you could say, well, maybe 50% of the country worked in decent paying jobs, and maybe another 25% okay wages, not great. And maybe 25% were really hurting. They weren't making enough money to live on. Today, you know, maybe you have 30% of the country that makes really good wages, and another 30% that maybe make okay wages. And then you have another maybe 20 to 25%, let's say, well, maybe 20%, let's say, that make those McDonald's wages, that type of thing. Maybe that's 20 to, I'd say that's about 20% of the country. And then you've got 10%, 15% of the country. What is left? About 20% of the country that makes not good wages, under the poverty line. I would say maybe 10% of the people are really hurting and making under the poverty line. Another 10% are right there, right at the poverty line. So, whereas in the past you had more people that were making decent wages, you had about 25% of the country that was hurting. Today you have less people that are hurting, but you have far less people that are making really good wages. And that's the problem. Whereas in the past, maybe 50% of the country was either at a decent wage or lower, all right, or lower. Today, that could be about 65%. By the way, I have young children. And of course, young children, the minute somebody takes their toy, it's like they were assassinated. So excuse the yelling. So today it's 65%. All right? And that's about right, because why? What happened? COVID happened. Okay? So now some of those people that were doing well, remember, going back to 2018, a lot of the country was doing very well. We were getting down to the low 3% in unemployment, and inflation stood still for about 18 months. But now that's not the case. And now we're doing more stimulating, which means inflation is going to get higher. And wages, because you're in this 65% now, those wages are not, 65% of people, your wages are not keeping up with inflation. They're not. And so that's the problem. And video is getting a little long, so I'm going to have to stop it right here. Most of my subsequent videos are going to be much shorter. So this is an introductory video, so it's probably going to be the longest one in this series. So what I wanted to end with is this. The only thing that's outpacing inflation is crypto for the last 3 years. And that's an interesting statement because 3 years ago, most cryptocurrencies lost value, crashed to earth, lost about 70, 80, 90% of their value or more. And everybody thought, well, this is the end of that thing. That thing is goofy and crazy. It's the Wild West of money. So why am I advocating for it? Because of this one known feature about cryptocurrency. Since 2018, it has greatly outpaced inflation. Cryptocurrency has outpaced inflation. Just to give you an idea, gold, back in, I think, 2015, 2016, 2017, gold was more valuable than most, or if not all, cryptocurrencies, okay? And we're talking about per ounce. And that's 3-4 years ago, okay? Today, it's 2021 now. Today, gold is roughly $1,800 an ounce. Bitcoin, and I remember Bitcoin last year, I think it was last summer, it was down $5,000 or so. And it had gone up to 5,000. It was really, I remember at one point looking at it sometime, I think around 2015. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe around that time it was $400 or $500. And gold was $600, $700, I believe. Could be wrong about that, but I don't remember the year, but I remember seeing that one day. Wow, Bitcoin is almost as valuable as gold. And that wasn't very long ago. I'm thinking it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, but I'm not sure. But that's not that long ago. Today, Bitcoin, this morning at one point, one Bitcoin was $51,000. Now, something that's 2,000, do the math, that's 25 times bigger than gold. And 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was worth less than gold. Maybe even sooner than that. Maybe even 2017 it was less than gold. I don't remember. I only started watching this in 2018 when it was maybe 1,000, maybe less, you know. I think it was $1,100, $1,200 when I first started tracking the prices of Bitcoin. And that must have been late 2018 or later. But I remember last summer seeing that around my birthday it was around $6,000. And I thought, gee, at one point it was up to 11 or 12, and now it's down to 6. Well, what happened since then? Well, you know, a lot of people had a lot of hopes politically in Donald Trump's economic policies. Well, Donald Trump isn't around anymore. And so people are realizing that this is outpacing inflation, and they're starting to go to it. Now, there's a lot more to cryptocurrency than that one little sentence that I just offered. It's an inflation hedge. There's a lot more to it than that. And I'm going to put together a lot of videos to explain to you what exactly cryptocurrency means to a lot of people. It's not just some inflation hedge or something. It's not some temporary place to put your money. It's a lot more than that. And so in subsequent videos, I'm going to explain just what those are. Anyway, thank you for watching. This is Scott Montgomery with the Small Town Mercer, and I'll be releasing videos on this topic very shortly. Several of them, as a matter of fact. So thank you for watching, and God bless you.